Earth feels permanent when you stand on it. The ground seems solid, the sky familiar, the oceans old beyond thought. It is easy to believe this world was always meant to look more or less the way it does now. But almost every chapter of Earth's history tells a different story. There were ages when no human eye could have recognized this planet at all, when the continents were gone, the air was poisonous, the seas were absent, and even the idea of survival would have felt absurd. If a distant intelligence had visited our world again and again across deep time, it would not have seen one planet growing steadily into maturity. It would have seen a sequence of strange worlds wearing the same name. And the first of them was almost beyond imagination. To understand Earth, we have to let go of the version we know. The blue planet of clouds and oceans is only a recent image, a brief still frame taken from a much longer and much more violent film. Across billions of years, Earth has repeatedly transformed itself so completely that each new era might as well have belonged to another solar system. The world that produced forests, animals, and eventually us began not as a cradle, but as a furnace. It did not begin as a sanctuary for life. It began as a place where even the word habitable would have sounded like a fantasy. If we could send a group of patient observers backward through time, they would not find a familiar home waiting for them in the distant past. They would find a planet in the middle of becoming, and the further back they travelled, the less Earth would resemble anything we could comfortably call Earth at all. Let them arrive around 4.5 billion years ago, not quite at the very beginning, but close enough to witness a world still in planetary infancy. What they would see below them is not a calm globe wrapped in oceans and air. It is a young sphere of heat, restless and unstable, a surface dominated by molten rock and violent impacts. Earth is not even 100 million years old yet. By human standards, that sounds unimaginably ancient. By planetary standards, it is barely born. This earliest Earth is still carrying the raw energy of its own assembly. Planets do not simply appear as finished worlds. They form through collision, compression, and accumulation, as smaller bodies merge into larger ones. In the young solar system, this process was relentless. The space around the infant sun was crowded with rock, metal, ice, and debris, all moving through unstable orbits, all colliding, shattering, and reassembling. Earth grew by enduring this chaos. Matter fell inward, impact after impact, adding mass and heat in a process we call accretion. Every collision brought more material. Every collision also brought violence. So the early planet is not just hot because it formed near a young sun. It is hot because it is being built through catastrophe. Each impact delivers energy. Each compression of matter stores heat inside the planet. Radioactive elements within the young Earth also release energy as they decay. Taken together, these forces help keep much of the surface in a semi-molten state. Our observers would not see stable continents. They would see a glowing, viscous landscape, a world still soft enough to flow. The sky above would offer little comfort. The earliest atmosphere was thin and temporary, composed largely of light gases such as hydrogen and helium. But this young Earth had not yet fully developed the magnetic shield that protects our world today. Without that protection, much of the early atmosphere was vulnerable to the solar wind, a constant stream of charged particles pouring outward from the sun. Those particles could strip away the lightest gases, leaving the planet exposed and unstable. Radiation from space and from the sun itself would have made this world even harsher. If our distant visitors were searching for signs of promise, they would have needed imagination. And yet even here, in conditions that seem almost designed to repel life, the future is already being assembled, piece by piece. At some point in this early era, Earth endured one of the most consequential collisions in its entire history. A protoplanet, likely around the size of Mars, struck the young Earth in a glancing but catastrophic impact. The exact details remain a matter of modelling and debate, but the broad outline is compelling. The collision blasted vast amounts of material into orbit, and from that debris, the Moon formed. It is difficult to overstate how important this event may have been. The Moon is so familiar to us that it can seem permanent, inevitable even. but it was born from a planetary wound. To our imagined observers, this would make Earth look even less stable, not more. A world of lava below, debris above, radiation all around, and the fresh memory of a giant collision still written into the system. It would not look like a world on the threshold of habitability. It would look like a place still fighting to exist in any coherent form at all. But this is where Earth's story begins to reveal one of its deepest patterns. Conditions that seem purely destructive often become the very means by which transformation begins. The same bombardment that keeps the planet violent may also be delivering ingredients that the future will depend on. Among the many bodies colliding with early Earth are asteroids and comets carrying volatile compounds, including water. Not all of Earth's water necessarily arrived this way, and the question is more complex than any single explanation. Some water may have been present in material that helped form the planet itself. Some may have come from multiple sources over time. But extraterrestrial delivery was almost certainly part of the story. That means the same impacts that make early Earth so hellish may also be helping seed one of the most important substances in its future. Water is arriving before oceans exist. The raw material of a blue planet is being delivered to a world that is not yet blue. As the young Earth continues to evolve, the interior begins to sort itself. Heavier elements sink downward toward the centre. Lighter materials rise higher. This differentiation helps establish the internal structure of the planet, including the metallic core that will become essential to generating a magnetic field. It also helps shape what happens near the surface. Water vapour and gases released by volcanic activity accumulate in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide becomes important, so do ammonia and other compounds emerging from the restless interior. The planet is still hostile, but it is no longer static. It is changing direction. Over long spans of time, cooling begins to matter. The outermost surface can solidify into a crust. That crust is unstable and frequently disrupted, but its existence marks an enormous shift. A planet cannot become geologically interesting, chemically rich, and eventually biologically active without crossing thresholds like this. A solid surface allows water to collect. Volcanic outgassing thickens the atmosphere in new ways. As temperatures gradually fall, water vapour can condense. Rains begin. Not once, not gently, but on scales difficult to picture. The first long transition toward oceans is underway. What would that look like from orbit? Perhaps not like a paradise emerging, more like a battlefield cooling after an endless bombardment. Vast clouds, steam, dark volcanic terrain, water gathering in basins, a young moon hanging far closer in the sky than it does today. Even then, Earth would still feel alien, but it would no longer feel impossible. And that distinction matters, because habitability is not a switch that flips on all at once. It is a slow construction project carried out by physics, chemistry, and time. The Earth did not become livable in a single moment. It moved through stages, each one setting conditions for the next. The crust formed, the oceans began to gather, the atmosphere evolved, the core helped establish a magnetic shield strong enough to better protect the planet from the solar wind. Each change made later changes more likely. What began as chaos started acquiring memory. This is one of the strangest truths about our planet. Earth did not inherit stability, it manufactured it. The calm world we know is the result of countless earlier instabilities, slowly interacting until something more durable emerged. In that sense, the young Earth is not merely a primitive version of the modern one. It is a different world operating under different rules, with a different face and a different future still undecided. Imagine our observers lingering just long enough to notice these first signs of direction. The lava fields are not gone, but they are no longer the whole story. The bombardment continues, but the surface is beginning to change. Water is no longer only a possibility carried in from space, it is becoming part of the planet itself. The atmosphere is no longer only something that is lost, it is being remade from below. Earth is still dangerous, still violent, still almost unimaginable by human standards. But for the first time, the world below contains a kind of unrealized promise. That promise would not be obvious. There are still no forests, no clouds reflected in calm seas, no animals, no continents we would recognise, no breathable air, and no guarantee that any of those things will ever come. But the mechanisms that could eventually allow them are now entering the scene, and once those mechanisms exist, even in crude early form, the future starts to widen. So perhaps our distant visitors, having seen enough of this frightening newborn planet, would leave unconvinced but curious. They would have witnessed a sphere of molten rock, a sky vulnerable to the sun, a surface battered by impacts, and a moon born in violence. They would also have seen the first gathering of water, the first meaningful cooling, and the first signs that Earth might become more than the sum of its catastrophes. If they returned 2 billion years later, they would not find the same world waiting for them. They would find a planet that has changed so profoundly it almost seems to have reinvented itself. A world of oceans, haze, microbial life, and a sky beginning to record the work of living things, where the next great mystery is not how Earth survived its birth, but how life learned to start changing the planet in return. That transformation begins slowly enough that our imaginary visitors might miss its scale at first. The planet no longer glows like a fresh wound, and the crust has long since formed, but Earth is still nothing like the world we know. If they return around 2.5 billion years ago, they find a planet some scientists have described as a pale orange dot. Oceans now cover much of the surface, and from a distance that might sound reassuring, almost modern. But the resemblance is deceptive. This Earth is draped in a methane-rich atmosphere, and through that atmosphere hangs a hazy orange veil that gives the whole planet an eerie, subdued glow. To look up from the surface would be even stranger. The moon looms much larger overhead than it does today, close enough to feel imposing, almost oppressive. Over immense stretches of time, the moon has been drifting away from Earth, and it is still doing so now, though only by a few centimetres each year. But in this ancient age, it is dramatically nearer, and that closeness matters. A closer moon exerts stronger tidal forces, and those tides would have had a powerful influence on the oceans, churning shorelines and shallow marine environments in ways our visitors could hardly ignore. Earth is calmer than before, but not yet gentle. It is still a world of intensity. And yet for the first time, it truly begins to look inhabited. If our observers were trained in astrobiology, they might descend toward the blue-green shallows and collect samples from the water. There, in microbial communities thriving under this alien sky, they would discover one of the most important revolutions in Earth's history. The world is now home to photosynthesizing bacteria, especially cyanobacteria, tiny organisms whose significance far exceeds their size. They are simple by later standards, but they possess an extraordinary capability. Using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, they make energy-rich compounds for themselves and release oxygen as a byproduct. It is difficult to think of a more consequential biological innovation. These microbes are not merely surviving on Earth, they are beginning to alter the chemistry of the entire planet. In places, they build layered structures we now call stromatolites, some of the oldest large-scale biosignatures in the geological record. They do this by trapping and binding grains of sediment within sticky microbial films, slowly creating rocky mounds that preserve the presence of life in a very physical way. To our alien visitors, these structures would be deeply suggestive. They would hint that biology is no longer a scattered curiosity. It is organised, persistent, and capable of leaving marks that endure long after the organisms themselves are gone. More importantly, these microbial communities are transforming the atmosphere. For a long time, oxygen released by photosynthesis did not accumulate freely in the air. It reacted with iron and other substances, becoming locked away in minerals and ocean chemistry. But eventually, after enough production over enough time, Earth crossed a threshold. Oxygen began to rise more substantially in the atmosphere, in what we now call the Great Oxidation Event. It was not a single dramatic afternoon in which the sky changed colour and the planet took a clean new breath. It was slower, messier, and spread across immense spans of time. But the effect was revolutionary all the same. A world once dominated by reducing gases began shifting into a new chemical regime. That change would have been catastrophic for many organisms already adapted to low oxygen conditions. For some of early life, oxygen was not a gift, it was poison. So even here, one of Earth's most important steps toward later complexity comes wrapped in destruction. The atmosphere is becoming more suitable for futures that do not yet exist, while becoming less hospitable to parts of the present. This is another pattern that will repeat again and again through planetary history. Progress is rarely clean. Every major shift opens possibilities and closes others. Earth does not move toward complexity by preserving everything. It moves by changing the rules. As oxygen levels rise, another profound change takes shape above the world itself. Some of that oxygen helps form ozone high in the atmosphere. The ozone layer becomes an invisible shield, reducing the most damaging incoming ultraviolet radiation from the sun. That matters because radiation had once been one of the great barriers to surface habitability. Now, for the first time, Earth is developing a more sophisticated form of planetary self-protection. Life is not just adapting to the environment. In a very real sense, life is helping construct a safer environment for future life. That idea is so strange, it is worth sitting with for a moment. A world born in fire and bombardment is now being modified by microscopic cells in shallow water. Nothing about those cells would look grand from orbit. They are not forests, not animals, not anything a human eye would instinctively call dramatic. But their influence is planetary. They are quietly re-engineering the atmosphere, altering radiation exposure, and laying foundations for biological possibilities still hundreds of millions and even billions of years away. The rulers of Earth at this stage are not giant and majestic. They are small, ancient, and everywhere. And still, if our visitors walked this world, they might find it more alien than the molten one that came before. There is now a solid crust and vast liquid oceans, yes, but the visual mood of the planet may feel almost dreamlike. The pale orange haze gives it a strange emotional distance. The shorelines would not host forests or animals, the continents would be barren. The sky would not resemble the familiar blues and whites of modern Earth. It might feel less like a living planet in the way we imagine one, and more like some haunting borderland between chemistry and biology, a world still deciding what life is allowed to become. But if they were patient enough, our observers would notice that this apparently simple world has become far more stable than the one they left behind. Earth now has a crust, oceans, a functioning magnetic field, microbial ecosystems, and an atmosphere beginning to bear the unmistakable signature of life. The ingredients of future transformation are no longer merely arriving from space or bubbling up from volcanic interiors. They are being processed, recycled, and amplified by living systems. The planet has entered a new relationship with itself. That is why this stage of Earth's history matters so much. It marks the point where geology and biology become inseparable. Before life, the planet changes because physics and chemistry demand it. After life appears and spreads, those changes gain a new driver. Organisms begin influencing the air, the oceans, the surface chemistry, and eventually even the climate in ways that can endure for eons. Earth is no longer just a world where life exists. It is becoming a world where life matters. And then, after nearly 2 billion more years of adjustment, something extraordinary happens. Our visitors return, expecting perhaps more of the same, more microbial life, more slow atmospheric evolution, perhaps a somewhat less alien surface. Instead, they find a world locked in ice. Around 650 million years ago, Earth enters one of the most severe climate states in its history, a period often associated with what is called Snowball Earth. According to this picture, ice spreads so extensively that much or even all of the planetary surface may have frozen over. The exact details remain debated, and, as with many windows into deep time, different models emphasize different degrees of severity. But however far the freeze ultimately extended, the planet was transformed on a scale almost impossible to overstate. Imagine the shock to those returning observers. The orange microbial world has become a frozen sphere. The seas are trapped beneath vast cover. The surface is blinding, white, silent and hostile, in a wholly different way from the hellscape of the Hadean. This is what makes Earth such a difficult planet to predict. It does not simply move from chaos to calm in a straight line. It overshoots, rebalances and reinvents. A world that once struggled to cool now becomes almost too cold. Temperatures may have fallen so far that even equatorial regions resembled the bitter conditions of modern Antarctica. Much of the ocean would have been sealed under ice, and the distinction between land and sea would have become difficult to read from above. Beneath that frozen shell, a supercontinent known as Pannotia occupied a significant portion of the globe, arranged in ways utterly unlike the continents we know now. But from the perspective of an outside visitor, continental geography might have been a secondary detail. The dominant impression would be glaciation on a planetary scale. Why did it happen? The answer is probably not singular. Earth systems rarely are. Possible contributors include declines in greenhouse gases, perhaps helped along by photosynthetic life drawing down carbon dioxide, changes in volcanic activity, and long-term orbital influences interacting with already vulnerable climate conditions. Whatever combination drove the shift, feedback loops likely amplified it. Ice reflects sunlight efficiently. More ice means more reflection. More reflection means less absorbed heat. Less heat allows more ice. Once that cycle begins across enough of the planet, cooling can accelerate into something extreme. At first glance, this might seem like a reset severe enough to erase life altogether. After all, if early Earth threatened life with heat, radiation and impacts, surely a nearly frozen planet would threaten it with equal force. Our alien visitors might be forgiven for assuming they had arrived too late, that the brief experiment of life on Earth had stalled beneath the ice. But life, once established, turns out to be astonishingly stubborn. In the oceans, beneath ice cover and around hydrothermal systems where the planet's internal heat still meets seawater, microbial communities endure. Cyanobacteria likely persist in protected niches. Other microbial forms, including red algae and increasingly complex eukaryotic lineages, continue their quiet struggle for survival. Complex multicellular ecosystems have not yet fully taken hold in the way they later will, but the central fact remains remarkable. Life survives the freeze. Not comfortably, not universally, but persistently. That persistence changes the meaning of everything that comes after. Up until now, one could still imagine Earth as a fragile experiment, repeatedly teetering on the edge of failure. Snowball Earth suggests something else. By this point, life has become resilient enough to outlast not just one planetary crisis, but multiple completely different kinds of crisis. It survives bombardment. It survives atmospheric upheaval. It survives radical freezing. The biosphere is still primitive by later standards, but it is no longer tenuous in the same way. It has roots. You can almost imagine our returning observers arguing among themselves out on those endless frozen plains. One of them, exhausted by the planet's refusal to become predictably habitable, might complain that Earth is nothing but a series of disappointments. First lava, then microbial haze, now ice without end. But another, older and more perceptive, might begin to suspect the deeper truth. This world is not failing to stabilize, it is experimenting, and every one of these brutal phases is teaching the biosphere new forms of endurance. That matters because the next reinvention will be even more dramatic. When the ice eventually retreats and the planet warms again, Earth will not return to the simple microbial world it once was. The stage is being prepared for complexity on a new level, for oceans filled with larger organisms, for landscapes that will one day host plants, animals, and entire ecosystems thick with interaction and competition. The frozen silence is real, but it is not empty. It is a pause before a very different kind of world begins to emerge, one in which life will no longer merely endure the planet's upheavals, but start building something far more intricate on top of them. What rises after the ice is not just recovery, but a new level of biological ambition. As the frozen grip loosens and the planet warms again, the oceans begin to fill with possibilities that had never existed before on such a scale. For most of Earth's history, life had been microbial, persistent, and world-altering in subtle ways. Now the biosphere begins to experiment with bodies, behaviours, and ecological roles that feel startlingly new. The seas become crowded with forms that can move, hunt, burrow, filter, grasp, and defend themselves. The change is so profound that it stands as one of the great turning points in the history of life, a burst of innovation we now call the Cambrian explosion. If our returning observers descended into those ancient waters, they would no longer find a world dominated only by microbial mats and chemically simple communities. They would enter a living system full of interactions. Creatures drift through the water column, others crawl across the sea floor. Some feed by filtering particles from the water, some scavenge, some ambush, some armour themselves, some grow spines. Evolution, which had long been shaping life in quieter ways, now seems to accelerate into visible complexity. This was not magic, and it was not sudden in the way a human event feels sudden. It unfolded over millions of years, which in geology is still brief, but not instantaneous. Yet even with that caution, the effect remains extraordinary. The fossil record begins to preserve a wide variety of organisms with hard parts and distinctive body plans. Trilobites become some of the most famous inhabitants of these seas, their segmented bodies spreading across marine environments in remarkable abundance. Brachiopods, those clam-like animals with a very different internal design from true clams, anchor themselves in great numbers. Other organisms occupy stranger places in the tree of life, revealing how experimental evolution could be when the ecological landscape was still so open. It is one thing for a planet to host life. It is another for life to become structurally inventive. Once bodies grow larger and more specialized, the logic of the biosphere changes. Organisms begin shaping one another's destinies more directly. Predators drive the evolution of armor and speed. Burrowers churn sediments and alter seafloor chemistry. Reef builders create habitats for others. Complexity does not merely add variety, it rewrites the rules of survival. By the time our observers next return in earnest, the world has moved even farther from its frozen past. Around 380 million years ago, during the Devonian period, Earth begins to look faintly recognizable from orbit. The oceans are blue, the atmosphere is clearer. Land masses, though very different from modern continents, stand out more sharply. At this time, a huge southern supercontinent called Gondwana dominates much of the globe, incorporating regions that will one day become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. The arrangement of land and sea still bears little resemblance to the map in a school atlas, but from a distance, the world now carries something almost familiar. The resemblance only deepens if our alien visitors descend to the coast. The first thing they might notice is the climate. Much of the planet during the Devonian is warm, especially compared with later ice-dominated ages. Shallow seas spread widely across continental shelves, creating rich marine environments where sunlight, nutrients, and evolving ecosystems all intersect. These waters are full of life. Trilobites are still present. Brachiopods remain common. Corals and reef communities flourish. Fish, however, are beginning to transform the mood of the seas more dramatically than anything else. This is one of the ages when vertebrate life in the oceans truly begins to assert itself. Jawless fishes had existed earlier, but now armoured and jawed forms diversify in impressive ways. Some of them are small, but others are formidable. Among the most striking are giant placoderms, armoured fishes whose appearance would leave little doubt that the oceans have become contested territory. One of the most famous is Dunkleosteus, a predator that may have reached around 10 metres in length, with bony plates forming a crushing apparatus at the front of its head, instead of teeth in the usual sense. Another giant hunter, Titanichthys, likely fed very differently, perhaps filtering small prey from the water despite its vast size. Even within these early vertebrates, we can already see ecological diversity expanding. And that is really the theme of this world. Diversity is no longer an abstract count of species. It is becoming an architecture of ecosystems.
Yet the truly revolutionary change is not confined to the oceans. It is happening at the margins, in the wet, muddy spaces where land and water meet. For much of Earth's past, the continents were barren in any sense we would instantly recognise. Rock, sediment, microbial crusts perhaps, but nothing like landscapes of stems, leaves and rooted growth. During the Devonian, that begins to change in a way that is easy to underestimate from our modern perspective. Plants are not just colonising land, they are inventing terrestrial environments. Early land plants had appeared before this, but the Devonian sees the spread of vascular plants, with tissues specialised for transporting water and nutrients. That innovation matters because it allows plants to grow larger, more upright, and more structurally complex. Roots begin to penetrate soils more deeply, stems gain support, leaves increase surface area for capturing sunlight. What had once been sparse green fringes now starts becoming something richer and taller. The implications are enormous. When plants expand across land, they do more than add colour. They change weathering rates. They influence the carbon cycle by drawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing carbon in biomass and eventually sediments. Their roots help break down rock, contributing to soil formation. They stabilise surfaces, alter runoff, and create habitats for countless other organisms. In a very literal sense, they make land more livable by remaking land itself. Imagine our observers stepping into one of these early forested environments. It would not look exactly like a modern woodland. Many familiar plant groups are absent or only beginning their long rise. But there are now tree-sized plants, including ancient relatives of ferns and early seed plant lineages. Some stands are dense enough to cast shade. Moist air hangs over swampy ground. Fallen organic matter begins to accumulate. Streams wind through landscapes that are biologically active in ways previous continents had never been. And then there is one of the strangest giants of the Devonian world, Prototaxites. For a long time, these towering structures puzzled paleontologists because they looked almost tree-like, yet did not fit neatly into the known plant groups of their age. The leading interpretation today is that Prototaxites was likely a giant fungus, or at least something closer to fungi than to trees in the way we would usually imagine them. Some specimens may have stood around 8 meters tall. To wander through a Devonian landscape and encounter an enormous trunk-like organism that is not truly a tree but a fungal body would have made the world feel simultaneously familiar and profoundly alien. Earth was growing more complex, yes, but it was doing so through combinations we would never have predicted in advance. Once plants and fungi establish themselves broadly on land, other pioneers begin following. Arthropods are among the first animals to make serious use of terrestrial environments. Millipede-like creatures, early arachnids, and other invertebrates explore moist soils and vegetation-rich margins. Their invasion of land is not a dramatic single march, but a gradual extension of ecological possibility. Still, every step matters, because each new terrestrial organism helps thicken the web of interactions above the shoreline. Decomposers process dead plant matter. Small grazers and predators appear. Land is no longer merely a surface, it is becoming an ecosystem. Soon, vertebrates begin testing those same boundaries. Among the most evocative of these transitional creatures are the early tetrapod-like animals, descendants of lobe-finned fishes whose anatomy begins adapting to movement in shallow, unstable environments. The famous forms are not modern amphibians, though they may remind us of them. They are experimental bodies built in a world where the distinction between fish and land vertebrate is still fluid. Stronger limb bones, more supportive joints, and lungs capable of supplementing gill breathing all become useful in swampy habitats where oxygen levels can fluctuate and water bodies may shrink or shift. One such animal from this broad transition, Ichthyostega, represents a world in which vertebrate life is beginning to move through reeds and muddy banks rather than only through open water. It is tempting to treat this as the moment life conquers land, but that language can mislead. Conquest suggests a clear victory and a finished outcome. What we really see is experimentation under pressure. Shallow waterways, floodplains, and vegetated margins create opportunities that reward flexibility. A fish that can prop itself up,
gulp air, or maneuver through cluttered environments gains advantages. Natural selection does not work towards some abstract goal of becoming terrestrial. It simply favours useful traits in specific conditions. Yet from enough of those local advantages, a planetary transition emerges. Our observers, if they were thoughtful, would notice something deeper here. Earth has now entered a stage where life is not just surviving the planet's changing conditions, and not just modifying the atmosphere in microbial ways, it is building multi-layered worlds. Oceans contain elaborate food webs. Land supports plants that alter geology and climate. Fungi and invertebrates process organic matter. Vertebrates are beginning to expand into entirely new physical spaces. Complexity is compounding itself. That compounding also introduces a new vulnerability. The richer an ecosystem becomes, the more tightly linked its parts can be. Predators depend on prey. Forests influence weather and erosion. Marine systems rely on balances of oxygen, nutrients, and temperature. A simple microbial world can be astonishingly resilient, precisely because so much of it is chemically distributed and ecologically broad. A complex biosphere contains more wonders, but it also creates more points of failure. The Devonian world feels triumphant because life has spread into water, mud, forest, and shore with such creativity. But every success deepens the consequences of disruption. And disruption is coming. Near the close of the Devonian, Earth experiences ecological crises that affect marine life especially severely. Reef systems suffer, many species disappear. The details involve changing climate, ocean chemistry, sea levels, and perhaps widespread oxygen loss in marine environments, with multiple pulses rather than one neatly isolated event. However we frame it, the lesson is consistent with everything Earth has already taught us. Flourishing never guarantees stability. A world can teem with life and still stand on the edge of collapse. From orbit, though, our visitors might still carry away an overwhelming impression of achievement. They had once seen a molten globe under bombardment, then a hazy microbial planet, then a frozen world locked in ice. Now they have walked among early forests and watched vertebrates testing the land. The change is astonishing. Earth has not simply become habitable, it has become intricate. And that intricacy begins setting in motion even larger planetary transformations. Plant expansion draws down carbon dioxide and helps cool the climate over long intervals. Continental arrangements continue shifting as plate tectonics slowly rearranges ocean basins and land masses. Over tens of millions of years, the stage is prepared for new extinctions, new climates, and new assemblages of life. Complexity survives, but it never stands still. That is why the Devonian matters so much in the long story of Earth. It is not merely an age of strange fish and primitive forests. It is the moment when the planet starts to feel layered in the way our own world does, with atmosphere, geology, oceans, plants, fungi, and animals locked into one another's fate. Earth is beginning to resemble a mature biosphere, but maturity on this planet does not mean peace. It means the system has become powerful enough and fragile enough for the next change to reach into every corner of the world, especially as the continents continue their slow collision toward an even stranger future. As those continents continue to drift, collide, and weld themselves together, the world grows harsher in ways that would be obvious even from space. By roughly 290 million years ago, Earth has entered the early Permian, and the arrangement of the land has become one of the most important facts about life itself. Much of the planet's continental crust is now gathering into a single immense supercontinent we call Pangaea. It stretches across an enormous sweep of the globe, altering coastlines, ocean circulation, rainfall patterns, and seasonal extremes on a planetary scale. To our returning observers, the sight would be both magnificent and unsettling. Earlier Earths had looked fragmented, fluid, or biologically tentative. This one looks consolidated, powerful, and severe. The consequences of such a landmass are profound. When continents merge into a supercontinent, the interior can become climatically isolated from the moderating effects of the sea. Coastal regions may still receive moisture, but vast inland expanses are pushed far from oceanic influence. Rain shadows form behind mountain ranges. Seasonal swings can become extreme. Some regions turn dry and hostile. Others remain lush, especially where water is abundant and topography shapes local climate differently. Earth is no longer simply a warm biological world growing more complex. It is a world of sharp environmental contrasts. The southern portion of Pangaea, especially areas tied to the older supercontinent Gondwana, still bears the memory of deep glaciation from the late Paleozoic icehouse. For millions of years, large ice sheets had expanded across southern high latitudes. Our observers might even catch the retreating traces of that frozen past, seeing landscapes marked by glacial action in places that are difficult to associate with ice today. But the climate is changing. Carbon dioxide levels rise and fall through long feedbacks involving tectonics, weathering, and biology. The Great Southern Glaciation gradually weakens. Earth is beginning to warm again. This is where the Permian becomes especially fascinating. It is not a world locked into one simple climate state. It is a world in transition, carrying remnants of icehouse conditions while moving toward a warmer and more arid future. The contrast between wet and dry, coast and interior, lowland and upland, becomes one of the defining experiences of the age. You could travel across this Earth and feel as though you had crossed between different planets. To understand why, imagine standing somewhere deep in the continental interior. The ocean is far away. Moisture has little chance of reaching you. Summers can be brutally hot. Winters may become bitterly cold. The daily and annual range of temperature is far greater than what many coastal ecosystems experience. Broad deserts and drylands emerge in many interior regions, while other areas host seasonal rivers, floodplains or wetlands that briefly pulse with life when water is available. Pangaea creates not just a supercontinent, but a superclimate. And still, life does not retreat. It diversifies into the spaces that these new conditions create. The seas surrounding Pangaea are very different from modern oceans. One great ocean, Panthalassa, covers most of the planet. Along the margins of the supercontinent lies the Tethys Ocean, a warm marine region that helps support rich coastal ecosystems. If our alien observers descend into these waters, they would find a marine world at once ancient and bizarre. Brachiopods remain abundant. Reef systems still exist, though their composition differs from those of later eras. Crinoids, those graceful stalked echinoderms sometimes called sea lilies, anchor themselves to the seabed and lift their feeding arms into the current. Ammonoid relatives drift or swim through the open waters. Sharks and other fishes continue evolving in increasingly diverse directions. Among the most unforgettable marine creatures of the early Permian is Helicoprion. For decades, paleontologists puzzled over this animal because of the extraordinary fossil structure associated with it, a spiral arrangement of teeth unlike anything seen in modern vertebrates. The best current interpretation places that tooth whorl within the lower jaw, where new teeth rolled forward as older ones remained in a tightly coiled formation. To see Helicoprion alive would be to witness one of evolution's strangest engineering experiments. It likely moved through Permian seas as a predator built according to rules that later lineages never repeated. This is one of the great pleasures of deep time. Earth's past is filled not only with ancestors, but with alternatives. The land, meanwhile, is no less strange. If our observers move through freshwater environments and swampy margins, they may encounter creatures that seem to hover between categories familiar to us today. Large amphibian lineages still occupy important ecological roles, some of them bizarre in form. One of the most famous is Diplocaulus, an animal whose broad boomerang-shaped skull remains one of the most visually startling designs in vertebrate history. Why such a head evolved is still discussed, with possibilities involving hydrodynamics, defense, or stabilization in water. Whatever its precise advantage, the result is unmistakable. Evolution in the Permian is not conservative. It is willing to test forms that later ages would never preserve. But perhaps the most iconic land animal of the early Permian is Dimetrodon. Many people casually imagine Dimetrodon as a dinosaur, but it lived long before the dinosaurs appeared. It belongs instead to a lineage closer to the ancestry of mammals than to later reptilian giants. This fact alone makes the Permian more intellectually interesting than its popular image. It reminds us that Earth's history is not a neat ladder leading directly toward familiar outcomes. Whole dynasties of strange and successful animals ruled the land long before the first dinosaur egg was ever laid. Dimetrodon was a formidable predator, equipped with powerful jaws and supported by limbs that gave it a more sprawling stance than the upright posture of many later vertebrates. Yet what captures immediate attention is the tall sail rising from its back, formed by elongated neural spines. The precise function of this structure has been debated, but one leading idea is thermoregulation. In a world of strong thermal contrasts, the ability to absorb heat quickly in the morning or release it efficiently later in the day could offer real advantages. Even if display or species recognition also played a part, the sail reflects a planet where managing body temperature could be a matter of survival. That question of body temperature leads into one of the deeper stories of the Permian. Life on land is increasingly confronting climatic extremes, and those extremes reward new physiological strategies. Broadly speaking, animals that can regulate their internal conditions more effectively may gain major advantages in unstable environments. The Permian is not yet the age of modern, warm-blooded mammals or birds, but we can already glimpse evolutionary movement toward more refined control of metabolism and heat exchange. Earth's climate is driving biology into new experiments. This is especially clear when we consider that Pangaea did not merely reshape habitats, it reshaped time. On a fragmented planet with many coastlines and isolated basins, organisms can evolve in regional mosaics. On a supercontinent, barriers change. Some lineages can spread widely across connected land. Others become trapped in extreme interiors or specialized zones. Mountain building from continental collision raises fresh terrain and alters wind patterns. Rivers drain differently. Monsoonal systems may intensify seasonally in some places. In every direction, the structure of the planet is influencing the structure of life. You can imagine our returning observers crossing from one region to another and feeling almost disorientated by the range of conditions. In one place they move through wetter lowlands, where amphibians and lush vegetation still dominate. In another, they traverse dry interior landscapes where survival depends on conserving water and enduring harsh cycles of heat and cold. Along coastlines and inland seas, marine and terrestrial systems meet in biologically rich margins. The world is unified by one great continent, but that unity does not create sameness. It creates extremes. And extremes can be creative. That may be one of the most important lessons of the Permian. The world is not biologically exhausted by its difficult climate. On the contrary, pressure is driving innovation. Seed plants become increasingly important because they can reproduce without relying as directly on standing water in the way earlier plant groups often did. Reptile and reptile-like lineages diversify across drier habitats. Synapsids, the broad group that includes Dimetrodon and eventually leads toward mammals, become especially significant in terrestrial ecosystems. The future is branching in ways that are still almost impossible to recognize from within the moment. Yet for all its creative force, the Permian world also carries a shadow. The very processes that made Pangaea possible have altered the planet on a deep structural level. Continental collision has built mountains and changed erosion rates. The assembly of land masses has influenced ocean circulation and climate stability. Atmospheric balances continue shifting across long timescales. The biosphere has become rich, but it is also increasingly interconnected. Marine communities depend on stable chemistry and temperature. Land communities depend on water distribution, plant cover, and food web balance. The more complex the system becomes, the more pathways there are through which crisis can travel. This would not necessarily be obvious to an outside observer enjoying the spectacle of the age. From one angle, the early Permian seems like a triumph. Life occupies deserts, coasts, forests, rivers and oceans. Strange predators patrol the seas.
Towering sailed hunters roam the land. Evolution is restless and inventive. The supercontinent itself gives the world a sense of grandeur, a kind of planetary coherence. Earth appears mature, even confident. But this impression is deceptive in the most important way. Because Pangaea is not a final form, it is a setup. The giant continent has created the conditions for intense climatic stress. The oceans are vulnerable to disruption. Carbon cycling remains sensitive to changes in volcanism, weathering, and biological productivity. The biosphere has spread far and diversified widely, but that success means more can now be lost. Earlier in Earth's history, catastrophe often struck a world still relatively simple. The next catastrophe will strike a world that is crowded, layered, and ecologically ambitious. And that is why the early Permian feels so haunting in hindsight. It is full of life, but also full of foreshadowing. Every wetland, reef, desert basin, and tidal margin belongs to a world standing closer than it knows to the greatest biological crisis in its history. Our observers, if they had followed Earth long enough to recognize its patterns, might begin to sense it here. The atmosphere feels unstable. The climate feels strained. The planet's systems seem powerful but tightly wound. The creative tension of the age is real, yet so is the fragility beneath it. Soon the question will no longer be how life adapts to a strange world of supercontinents and extremes, but how much of that world can survive when the planet itself begins to turn violently against nearly everything living on it. That violence arrives with a scale so immense that even by Earth standards, it is difficult to comprehend. There had been extinctions before. Ecosystems had faltered, oceans had changed chemistry, climates had shifted. But what unfolds near the end of the Permian is something more severe than an ordinary crisis. It is the closest Earth has come, at least since complex life flourished, to biological devastation on a planetary scale. If our returning observers could compare every era they had witnessed so far, this would be the moment when the biosphere seemed least secure, not because life had failed to spread, but because it had become rich enough for collapse to echo everywhere at once. By around 252 million years ago, the great ecological experiment of the Paleozoic is pushed toward breaking point. The trigger most strongly associated with this catastrophe lies far to the north, in a region that would one day be called Siberia. There, volcanic activity erupts on a scale almost beyond imagination. Not a single mountain venting for a few years, but a vast episode of flood basalt volcanism in which enormous volumes of magma pour across the surface again and again, building one of the largest igneous provinces in Earth's history. To grasp what that means, it helps to stop imagining eruptions as isolated disasters and start imagining the planet itself opening for an extended geological convulsion. Lava spreads over immense areas. Volcanic gases flood the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide rises. Sulfur compounds enter the air. Heat builds through greenhouse forcing. Rainfall patterns are disrupted. Chemical cycles begin to warp. The Earth system starts feeding stress into itself through multiple channels at once. And the damage does not stop with the lava. As magma intrudes into surrounding rock, it likely heats and burns through organic-rich deposits, including coal and other carbon-bearing sediments. That process may have released even more greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide and methane, into the atmosphere. The exact proportions and feedbacks remain a matter of continued study, but the broad picture is deeply unsettling. The initial volcanism may have triggered secondary releases that amplified the crisis, turning an already severe disturbance into a prolonged environmental breakdown. To our alien observers, the first visible signs might be atmospheric. The sky itself would begin to carry the chemistry of catastrophe. Temperatures climb. On land, heat stress intensifies. Seasonal extremes become more punishing. In some regions, acid rain likely falls as volcanic emissions react with atmospheric moisture. Forests and plant communities face repeated assaults, not always in one dramatic moment, but through accumulations of damage that weaken resilience over time. What had once been a world of ecological variety and evolutionary experimentation
becomes a world in which survival margins steadily narrow.
The oceans fare no better. In fact, for many marine organisms, they become the centre of the disaster. As carbon dioxide enters seawater, ocean chemistry shifts. Acidification makes it harder for many organisms to build and maintain shells or skeletons of calcium carbonate. At the same time, warming reduces the amount of oxygen water can hold. Stratification may increase, preventing oxygen-rich surface waters from mixing efficiently with deeper layers. In some regions, anoxia spreads. Parts of the sea become oxygen-starved, and in the worst cases, euxinic, meaning depleted of oxygen and rich in toxic hydrogen sulfide. A marine biosphere that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build begins collapsing from the bottom up and the top down at once. Imagine our observers descending into the shallow seas that once teemed with brachiopods, crinoids, ammonoids, corals, and strange predatory fishes. They would find ecosystems thinning, then unravelling. Reef communities vanish or contract brutally. Many bottom-dwelling organisms lose the stable chemistry they depend on. Food chains fragment. The familiar rhythms of predation, filtering, scavenging, and reproduction become harder to sustain when the water itself is hostile. This is what makes the end Permian extinction so terrifying as a natural event. It is not merely that many species die, it is that the operating conditions of the planet shift against life across multiple systems simultaneously. Heat, acidification, oxygen loss, atmospheric disruption, and ecological interdependence combine into a crisis that few lineages are equipped to navigate. The numbers, even when expressed cautiously, are staggering. A huge majority of marine species disappear. On land, vertebrate groups are devastated. Insects, which often seem nearly indestructible across deep time, also suffer severely. Entire ecological frameworks collapse. The world after this extinction is not just poorer in species, it is emptier in function. That emptiness is difficult to picture because modern Earth feels so full. Even in damaged environments, we are accustomed to life crowding the margins. The post-extinction world may have looked different in a more fundamental way. Fewer large animals, simpler food webs, long stretches of terrain with reduced ecological activity, marine communities stripped of former complexity. The recovery is not immediate because extinctions of this magnitude do not leave behind a ready-made substitute biosphere. They leave gaps. Those gaps matter. Up to this point, the history of life on Earth could be described as one long accumulation of innovations, interrupted by crisis, but generally trending toward greater complexity and ecological spread. The end Permian does not erase that history, but it shatters its continuity. The dominant caste of the older world is cut down so dramatically that the future becomes radically open again. Whole groups that had defined earlier ecosystems are gone or greatly diminished. Habitats still exist, but many of their former occupants do not. And in that brutal vacancy lies the beginning of another transformation. This is the paradox at the heart of mass extinction. It is real destruction, not creative renewal in any sentimental sense. There is nothing gentle or purposeful about it. Yet by removing established dominances, extinction changes the field on which evolution operates. It can clear ecological space for survivors and for lineages that had once lived in the margins. The Earth after catastrophe is scarred, but it is also rearranged. In the immediate aftermath, however, that future is far from obvious. If our returning observers landed on Earth shortly after the worst of the extinction, they might reasonably wonder whether the planet had entered a prolonged biological twilight. The climate remains unstable. The atmosphere still reflects the effects of volcanic forcing. The oceans are recovering unevenly, if at all. On land, ecosystems are simplified and vulnerable. The grand Permian world of strange marine predators, sprawling wetlands, and diverse synapsid-dominated communities feels like a memory fading into rot. And yet, life is still there. It persists in refuges, in reduced populations, in opportunistic survivors. Some lineages endure because they are flexible in diet, others because they can tolerate heat, low oxygen, or unstable environments better than their competitors. Some simply survive by luck, geography,
or the particular timing of where they happen to be when the crisis peaks. Survival in mass extinction is not always a reward for superiority. Sometimes it is a combination of resilience and circumstance. Among the survivors and the lineages poised to benefit from the aftermath are archosaur relatives, members of the broader branch that will eventually give rise to crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. They are not yet the obvious rulers of the world. That is part of what makes this moment so important. The future often begins quietly. In the ruins of an older order, lineages that once seemed secondary can suddenly find room to expand. The same is true for the ancestors of mammals, though their road will be longer and less immediately dominant. Synapsid relatives survive in reduced forms and continue evolving through the chaos. The post-Permian Earth is not handing uncontested victory to any one group. It is creating a contested, unstable arena in which many survivors try to rebuild amid altered climates and damaged ecosystems. To understand why this matters, we need to let go of a comforting but misleading image of extinction as a clean page. The world after the end Permian event is not blank, it is wounded. Temperatures remain high, the carbon cycle is still disturbed, marine recovery is patchy. Biological communities are simplified, but they are also under ongoing pressure. Evolution in such a world does not begin from peace, it begins from strain. Every step toward new diversity has to climb through the debris of what was lost. That debris includes lost ecological memory. A reef is not just a pile of organisms. It is a structure built by generations of interacting life. A forest is not merely plants standing near one another. It is a web of soils, water flow, decomposition, pollination, shade, and competition. When extinction destroys too much, the surviving planet forgets how some systems used to function. Recovery then becomes more than the return of species. It becomes the reinvention of relationships. This is why the end Permian crisis echoes so deeply through the later history of life. It did not merely kill, it reordered the possibilities of the Mesozoic world to come. As the Triassic begins, the Earth that emerges is still hot, often dry, and ecologically unsettled. Pangaea remains assembled, its vast interior continuing to shape climate through distance from the sea and extreme seasonal contrasts. River systems cross broad landscapes, deserts occupy huge regions. Along coasts and certain wetter zones, recovery slowly takes hold. In the oceans, new communities start experimenting with forms and niches that have been emptied or weakened. On land, reptiles and reptile-adjacent groups diversify through the spaces opened by collapse. For our observers, this world would feel uncanny, not simply because so much has vanished, but because the survivors seem to be testing a new set of rules. The old Permian confidence is gone. In its place is something leaner, harsher, and strangely provisional. Yet beneath that provisional quality lies one of Earth's most persistent capacities. The planet does not stop after catastrophe. It reorganizes. That reorganization will eventually produce forests again, marine predators again, large herbivores again, and food webs of enormous sophistication. But the next dominant age will not be a continuation of the one that just ended. It will be a fundamentally different world, populated by creatures whose ancestors came through the bottleneck when so many others did not. And among those descendants are animals that for now still seem small in the story. They are not yet gigantic. They are not yet iconic. They do not yet cast the longest shadows across the land. But the ecological vacuum left by the Great Dying has opened a path toward their rise, and once Earth's climate and continents shift again, that path will widen into one of the most extraordinary reigns in planetary history. At first they would seem almost incidental, small figures moving through the margins of a world still recovering from disaster. The early members of the dinosaur lineage did not begin as the unquestioned rulers of Earth. They emerged within a broader Triassic landscape crowded with competitors, including other archosaurs, surviving synapsid relatives, amphibians, and marine reptiles in adjacent environments. For a long time, the future was not obvious. If our patient observers had returned during the earlier Triassic, they might have noticed dinosaurs at all, only because they were paying unusually close attention. But Earth has a habit of turning the overlooked into the decisive, and over millions of years, the conditions of the planet begin tilting in ways that favour a very different kind of world. By the late Jurassic, around 150 million years ago, that world is fully visible. From orbit, the first striking difference is geographical. Pangaea has begun to split apart. The great supercontinent that once imposed such severe climatic extremes is no longer intact. Rifting has opened new seaways. The northern and southern landmasses are separating into what we call Laurasia and Gondwana, and between them, the oceans are widening. The Atlantic is in its infancy, not yet the broad ocean basin we know today, but already the Earth's surface is being redrawn by tectonic forces. Continents that once formed one giant climatic machine are now drifting into new relationships with sea and sky. That rearrangement changes everything. When continents fracture, coastlines multiply. Ocean circulation evolves. Moisture can move differently across the land. Climatic contrasts do not disappear, but they are expressed through new patterns. Much of the Jurassic world is warm, with high levels of carbon dioxide and no permanent polar ice sheets. Sea levels are elevated. Shallow epicontinental seas spread into low-lying areas. Temperatures are generally more even across latitudes than on the modern Earth, and lush environments extend far into regions that today would be cooler or drier. To our alien observers, this would look like a greenhouse planet in full expression. Dense vegetation carpets broad stretches of land. Conifer forests dominate many regions, joined by cycads, ginkgos, ferns and horsetails. Flowering plants have not yet transformed the world in the way they later will, so the texture of the landscape remains different from a modern forest. It is greener in a deep, ancient sense, less floral, more structural, a world of needles, fronds, and thick undergrowth under heavy, warm skies. And moving through that vegetation are the animals that have come to define the age. Among the most astonishing are the sauropods, gigantic, long-necked herbivores whose scale still challenges the imagination. A creature like Diplodocus can stretch across lengths that make even large modern animals seem modest, its body a travelling machine for converting vegetation into motion and mass. Others, such as Brachiosaurus, carry their bulk differently, with forelimbs longer than hind limbs and necks rising high enough to browse vegetation beyond the reach of most other herbivores. To stand near one would be to confront a form of life that seems to belong equally to biology and architecture. These are not just large animals, they are ecosystems in motion, capable of reshaping vegetation, trampling pathways, redistributing nutrients, and supporting smaller scavengers and parasites in their wake. What makes their existence especially remarkable is that they are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a coherent planetary system that can support their size. Warm climates, abundant plant growth, and extensive habitats all help make gigantism possible. The Jurassic Earth is not merely tolerating giant herbivores, it is built in a way that allows them to thrive. Where there are giants, there are also hunters. One of the most iconic predators of this age is Allosaurus, a large theropod whose lightly built skull, serrated teeth, and powerful hind limbs made it a formidable carnivore in western North America, and perhaps analogous regions elsewhere. It is not alone. The Jurassic hosts a range of predatory dinosaurs of varying sizes, each occupying ecological roles within increasingly complex terrestrial food webs. Some may have hunted young sauropods or smaller herbivores, others likely scavenged when the opportunity arose. The details of behaviour remain partially hidden by time, but the structure of the ecosystem is unmistakable. Herbivores are abundant, and predators have diversified to exploit them. Our observers, having seen earlier Earths shaped by microbial films, primitive forests, and odd sail-backed synapsids, might be tempted to describe this age as the first truly majestic animal world. Everywhere they look, size and movement dominate the scene. Herds of enormous herbivores pass through river valleys. Stegosaurs, with their plated backs and spiked tails, browse among lower vegetation. Smaller dinosaurs move between their feet or along the forest edge. Predators shadow the margins. The land is no longer experimentally complex. It is decisively inhabited by large, specialized, highly successful vertebrates. And above them, another revolution is underway. The skies of the Jurassic are not empty. Pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight, move through the air in a variety of forms. Some are modest in size, others are larger and more imposing, capable of gliding over coastlines or inland waters with an elegance that would have seemed impossible during the age of Dimetrodon or Prototaxites. These are not birds, though they share with birds the astonishing fact of vertebrate flight. They belong to their own branch of archosaur evolution, another reminder that Earth's history repeatedly produces solutions that later ages do not preserve in the same form. At the same time, the lineage that will become birds is beginning to show itself more clearly. Among the most famous signals of this transition is Archaeopteryx, a creature from the late Jurassic that combines features we readily associate with birds, such as feathers, with other traits that reveal its deep dinosaurian ancestry. Whether it was a strong flyer, a glider, or something in between is still debated, but the symbolic importance is undeniable. It tells us that the boundary between dinosaur and bird is not a clean break. It is an evolutionary gradient. The Jurassic sky already contains the beginnings of one of the most enduring vertebrate lineages on Earth. The seas, meanwhile, are just as dramatic. Marine reptiles patrol the oceans, though they are not dinosaurs in the strict sense. Ichthyosaurs, shaped in some ways like modern dolphins through convergent evolution, move with streamlined efficiency through open water. Plesiosaurs and pliosaurs occupy other marine predatory roles, some with long necks adapted to striking at prey, others with massive heads suited for more forceful hunting. Ammonites drift or swim in great diversity. Reefs and shallow marine systems support rich communities of invertebrates and fishes. The Jurassic world is not only dinosaur-dominated on land, it is broadly vertebrate-rich across sea, shore, and sky. What makes this age so important is not merely its spectacle. It is the way planetary conditions and biological opportunity have become aligned. The breakup of Pangaea opens new coastlines and habitats. Warm greenhouse conditions support extensive plant productivity. Rising sea levels create rich, shallow marine environments. Dinosaur lineages, already positioned by earlier extinction and adaptation, expand into niches across the globe. Earth has entered one of those rare intervals when tectonics, climate, and evolution all reinforce one another in the same general direction. To our returning observers, it might finally seem as though the planet has found a stable identity. After all, this Jurassic Earth is not a transient microbial phase or a post-extinction wasteland. It is mature, abundant, and visually coherent. The major environments are populated by dominant, highly adapted organisms. Forests are thick, herbivores are vast, predators are efficient. The atmosphere supports life at every visible scale. If one was searching through Earth's history for an age that looks self-confident, this would surely qualify. But Earth's confidence is rarely permanent. Even at the height of dinosaur dominance, subtle countercurrents are already running beneath the surface. In shadowed burrows, beneath roots, within leaf litter and underbrush, small mammals continue living mostly nocturnal or otherwise low-profile lives. They are not yet the stars of the age. Most are tiny, vulnerable, and ecologically constrained by the immense reptiles that dominate larger roles. Yet they possess a combination of traits that will matter greatly later. Insulation in the form of hair or fur, more refined temperature regulation, acute senses suited to low-light conditions, and flexible feeding behaviours all help them persist in niches that do not require giant size. It is tempting to dismiss such creatures because they do not fit the visual grandeur of the Jurassic. But history on Earth repeatedly warns against that mistake. Small does not mean unimportant. Marginal does not mean doomed. Survivors are not always the most conspicuous members of their age. Sometimes they are the ones quietly developing the versatility needed for worlds not yet born. The plants, too, are laying groundwork for future transformations. While flowering plants have not yet taken over, the terrestrial biosphere continues changing through competition, climate shifts, and regional differences in vegetation. Insects diversify in relation to these plant communities.
Freshwater systems support their own complex webs of life. Soil processes, decomposition, and nutrient cycles bind the visible dinosaur world to invisible microbial and fungal networks beneath it. The Jurassic biosphere is grand on the surface, but it is also intricately layered below. That layering makes it resilient in many ways, but not invulnerable. The same tectonic dynamism that creates new seas and productive coastlines also ensures that Earth will keep changing. Continents continue their separation. Ocean circulation patterns evolve over time. Atmospheric chemistry does not remain fixed. Volcanism persists in reshaping regions and influencing climate over the long term. Evolutionary success itself produces specialization, and specialization can become a liability when environments shift. A world full of giants is impressive, but giant worlds often depend on stable abundance. Our imagined observers might feel a certain awe in recognizing how far Earth has come. They had watched it survive impacts, oxygen revolutions, frozen global crises, expanding forests, supercontinental extremes, and the Great Dying. Now it supports one of the most visually astonishing ages in its history, a world where the largest land animals ever to live are not aberrations, but recurring elements of the landscape. The temptation would be to assume that such dominance must endure. And for a very long time, in human terms, it does. Dinosaurs and their relatives remain central to Earth's ecosystems across tens of millions of years. Their rule is not fragile in the immediate sense. It is expansive, persistent, and geographically broad. But longevity can be misleading. The fact that an age lasts a long time does not mean it is immune to sudden endings. Earth's past has already shown that whole regimes of life can seem secure right up until the moment the underlying conditions change too fast or too violently for most of them to adapt. That is what makes the late Mesozoic so haunting in retrospect. Beneath all the grandeur, the future is already gathering beyond the horizon. Small mammals still wait in the margins. Bird-like dinosaurs refine abilities that will carry one branch of the lineage onward. Continents continue moving. The planet keeps adjusting itself in ways that no dominant creature can fully control. From the ground, the Jurassic feels eternal. From deep time, it is another brilliant but temporary arrangement. And when the next great disruption comes, it will not begin as a slow, visible decline across millions of years. It will arrive with the force of a single event, so extreme that the familiar world of giants will be broken in what is, geologically speaking, almost an instant. A day that will divide Earth's history into before and after. That instant begins far from the animals who will suffer it, in the darkness of space. For millions of years, the late Cretaceous world appears rich, successful, and enduring. Dinosaurs still dominate terrestrial ecosystems in astonishing variety. Flowering plants have spread widely across many landscapes, changing the character of forests and the insects that move among them. Continents have drifted farther toward recognizable positions. Seas still flood portions of the continents. The climate remains generally warm, though not uniform. From the perspective of any creature living through it, there is no obvious signal that one of the great biological regimes of Earth is about to end. And then, roughly 66 million years ago, an asteroid around 10 kilometers wide slams into the planet. It strikes what is now the Yucatan region, excavating the structure we call the Chicxulub crater. The speed of impact is immense. The energy released is beyond ordinary disaster, beyond earthquake, eruption or storm, as living things usually experience them. Rock vaporizes, shock waves race outward, material is blasted high into the atmosphere and beyond it. Near the impact zone, everything is immediate devastation. But the true planetary significance lies not only in the impact itself, it lies in what the impact throws into the Earth system. If our long-watching observers happen to be in orbit, they would see the event as a flash of almost incomprehensible violence. Debris arcs outward. Dust, sulfate-rich material, and molten ejecta begin their journey through the atmosphere. Across distant regions, some of that ejecta re-enters at high speed, heating the sky and contributing to widespread thermal pulse effects. Fires may ignite across broad areas, though the exact extent and uniformity of global firestorms remain matters of continuing discussion.
What is not in serious doubt is that Earth is suddenly enveloped in cascading consequences.
On land, the first hours and days would be apocalyptic beyond anything large dinosaurs had ever encountered. Tsunamis race across nearby seas. Shockwaves disturb regions far from the crater. Wildfires and intense heating affect large portions of the surface. But again, these are only the opening blows. The longer crisis comes from darkness. Dust and aerosols lofted into the atmosphere block incoming sunlight. Photosynthesis begins to fail. Temperatures drop sharply as the planet enters an impact winter. Food webs dependent on living plant matter collapse from the base upward. Herbivores lose their primary energy source. Carnivores lose theirs as the herbivores die back. Even in the oceans, where the impact zone is distant for many communities, reduced sunlight damages plankton and the larger chains of life built upon them. This is why one impact can change the biosphere of an entire planet. It does not need to reach every organism directly. It only needs to break the systems those organisms depend on. The geological evidence for this event is one of the most compelling detective stories in science. Around the world, in rocks marking the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods, geologists found an unusual enrichment of iridium, an element relatively rare in Earth's crust, but more common in some extraterrestrial material. That thin global layer became one of the key clues that something from space had been involved. Other signs followed. Shocked quartz indicated immense pressures. Tiny glassy spherules and tektite-like materials pointed to molten ejecta from a major impact. Eventually, the buried crater itself, Chicxulub, became the missing scar in the story. To our imaginary observers, though, no detective work would be needed. They would watch the world change in real time. One day the land is full of familiar late Mesozoic life. Large herbivorous dinosaurs browse through vegetation. Predators hunt them. Birds, already a surviving branch of dinosaur evolution, move through the skies and trees. Insects pollinate flowering plants. Coastal ecosystems pulse with reptiles, fish, and invertebrates. Then light fades, temperatures swing, and the abundance that once made this world seem secure becomes a trap. Large animals with high food demands are especially vulnerable when productivity crashes. Specialized lineages suffer as the structure of the biosphere disintegrates beneath them. This is one of the hardest truths in Earth's history. Dominance does not guarantee durability. In stable or gradually changing conditions, size and specialization can be extraordinary advantages. In sudden global crisis, they can become liabilities. The non-avian dinosaurs had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for a vast span of time, but many of them were tied to food webs too large and too disrupted to recover through the impact winter. Entire lineages disappear. It is important to say this carefully. Not all dinosaurs vanish. Birds survive because birds are dinosaurs in the evolutionary sense. But the great non-avian branches, the giant land dwellers that defined the age in the human imagination, are gone. With them vanish pterosaurs. Many marine reptiles disappear as well. Ammonites, so long a feature of ancient seas, are lost. A world that had felt ancient and self-assured is cut apart in a relatively brief geological interval. And still, as always, life does not end. Some organisms endure precisely because they are not built for grandeur. Small mammals, often generalized in diet and capable of sheltering in burrows or hidden spaces, make it through. Birds survive in some forms. Crocodilians endure. Turtles persist. Various amphibians and fishes continue across the boundary. In the oceans, though the losses are severe, enough lineages remain to rebuild later communities. Survival is selective, uneven, and often brutal, but it is real. Earth does not become sterile, it becomes rearranged. This distinction matters because the end Cretaceous extinction is often remembered only as the death of the dinosaurs, when in fact it is also the opening of a radically different biological future. Once the non-avian dinosaurs are removed, ecological roles across the land become available in new ways. Mammals, long constrained mostly to small-bodied niches by the structure of Mesozoic ecosystems, find opportunities suddenly widened. They do not instantly become giant rulers overnight. Recovery still takes time. Ecosystems remain damaged.
but the limits that had long shaped mammalian possibilities begin to loosen.
Picture our observers returning not in the immediate aftermath of the impact, when darkness and collapse still dominate, but a little later, once sunlight has returned and the first phases of recovery are underway. The world is quieter in one sense. The giant herds are gone. The immense predators no longer patrol the same landscapes. Yet the silence is not emptiness. It is possibility. Small mammals explore broadened niches. Bird lineages radiate into forms that will eventually occupy forests, shores, grasslands, and skies across the world. Plants recover. Insects rebuild their relationships with flowering species. The biosphere begins, once again, to invent itself from reduced conditions. But even here, it would be too simple to imagine the asteroid as the only force in play. Earth systems are rarely governed by a single variable. Around this same broad interval, immense volcanic activity associated with the Deccan Traps in what is now India was also releasing gases and altering climate. Scientists continue debating the exact balance between impact and volcanism in producing the extinction pattern, though the Chicxulub impact remains central and powerfully supported as a primary driver of the boundary crisis. What matters for our larger story is that catastrophe on Earth often comes through stacked stresses, overlapping disturbances, and feedbacks that interact, rather than through neat, isolated causes. That complexity does not weaken the significance of the asteroid. It strengthens our understanding of how fragile dominance can be. The late Cretaceous world was not weak. It was extraordinarily successful. Its collapse shows that even the most established regimes of life remain contingent on planetary conditions beyond their control. You can feel this contingency most sharply if you imagine standing just before the impact, looking out over a lush floodplain or coastal forest, alive with late Cretaceous motion. Everything about the scene suggests continuity. Eggs will hatch, predators will feed, seasons will turn, rivers will shift slowly across the land. Nothing in the ordinary rhythms of the day announces the end of an age. Then a rock from space, itself indifferent to life, intersects Earth's orbit at exactly the wrong moment for the reigning order of the biosphere. That is all it takes to reroute the future. This is why the extinction still feels so emotionally powerful. It compresses deep time into an almost human scale of shock. Other transitions unfolded over millions of years. This one contains an unmistakable day of impact, a before and after so sharp that even now we can trace it in rock around the world. It reminds us that Earth's history is not only slow transformation. Sometimes it is sudden fracture. And yet sudden fracture is never the end of the story. The survivors carry the future forward in forms that the past would have underestimated. Mammals, once peripheral, will enter their great expansion. Birds will become one of the most successful vertebrate groups on the planet. Flowering plants will continue reshaping terrestrial ecosystems. New marine communities will emerge. The post-impact world will not restore what was lost. It will build something else. For our returning observers, this would be the old lesson once more, but delivered with unusual force. Earth does not protect its most iconic creatures simply because they are iconic. It does not preserve an age because that age has lasted a long time. It keeps moving, and when the rules change, survival often belongs to the adaptable, the sheltered, the small, and the fortunate. The dinosaur world, magnificent as it was, could not endure the sudden darkness. But the lineages in the margins could, and from those margins, a new chapter begins to unfold, one that raises a deeper question than whether the asteroid alone ended the age of giants. Because elsewhere in Earth's history, catastrophe also came from another source entirely, and sometimes the agents of destruction did not fall from the sky at all. Sometimes they rose from the Earth itself. If we step back from the shock of the Chicxulub impact and look across the full sweep of planetary history, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Earth's greatest biological turning points are not all triggered by the same kind of catastrophe. Some come from space, sudden and violent, delivered in a moment that rewrites everything after it. Others come from within the planet, building through volcanism, atmospheric change, disrupted oceans, and altered climate over spans long enough to feel gradual in human language, yet fast enough in geological terms to destabilize entire worlds. The deeper lesson is not that one type of disaster matters more than the other. It is that life on Earth has always existed inside the restless machinery of a planet that can transform the conditions of survival from below as easily as from above. That is why the asteroid alone cannot be the final word in this story. Even in the end Cretaceous crisis, volcanism in the form of the Deccan Traps was already reshaping the background climate and chemistry of the world. The Chicxulub impact stands as the most dramatic punctuation mark, but Earth's environmental systems were not necessarily calm and untouched before the blow landed. The same has been true at other moments in deep time. Catastrophe often works through layered pressures rather than a single neat cause. To understand how Earth remakes life, we have to hold that complexity in mind. And nowhere is that more revealing than in another ancient crisis, one that did not end with a fallen asteroid, but began with the planet opening itself across enormous volcanic provinces during the late Triassic, in an interval often associated with the Carnian pluvial episode and the broader environmental instabilities around it. At first glance, the Carnian world might seem less famous than the age of dinosaurs, or the day the sky darkened at the end of the Cretaceous. But in terms of what it tells us about planetary transformation, it may be one of the most important chapters of all. Around 234 million years ago, the Earth experienced major climatic disruption linked to intense volcanism, often associated with the Wrangellia Large Igneous Province. Massive outpourings of basalt released huge volumes of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. Once again, as in the end Permian, the issue was not merely lava on the surface, it was the way volcanism could push the climate system out of balance. The result was a period of pronounced environmental upheaval. Temperatures rose, the hydrological cycle intensified. Rainfall patterns changed dramatically enough that the interval became known for its wet conditions, a striking departure from the generally arid Triassic climate that had dominated so much of Pangaea. Carbon cycles shifted, ocean chemistry changed, ecosystems on land and in the sea came under pressure. If our long-watching observers had returned during this episode, they would have found a world in transition yet again, but the nature of that transition would have been different from the sudden darkness after Chicxulub. This was not a single day of annihilation. It was a sustained planetary disturbance, one that reshaped the setting in which lineages competed. Forests and river systems changed under altered rainfall regimes. Marine environments absorbed new chemical stresses. Species that had flourished under older conditions faced challenges they were not built to handle. Others found opportunity in the turbulence. That is the crucial point. Catastrophe does not always work by simple subtraction. Sometimes it weakens the established order just enough for previously minor lineages to expand into greater prominence. The Carnian pluvial episode seems to have been one of those moments. As ecosystems reeled under climatic and geochemical stress, dinosaurs began gaining a more decisive foothold on land. They had existed before, but they were not yet the dominant vertebrates of the terrestrial world. In the aftermath of environmental reorganization, however, their relative importance appears to increase. Older competitors declined or lost ground in some settings. Dinosaurs, with their own adaptive advantages, expanded into ecological roles that would eventually support their rise across the Mesozoic. In this sense, the volcanic crisis did not simply destroy, it rearranged. You can almost imagine our alien observers struggling with the moral ambiguity of such a conclusion. They had seen life suffer through bombardment, freezing, oxygen upheaval, and the Great Dying. They had watched the asteroid erase the age of giant reptiles. Now they witness another kind of disaster, one that disrupts climate, acidifies waters, and stresses ecosystems, yet also helps open the path toward the most famous vertebrate age in Earth's history. Was the catastrophe creative? No, not in any purposeful or benevolent sense. It was indifferent. But evolution is opportunistic, and when a crisis empties certain spaces or rewrites the environmental rules, some lineages will inevitably find new openings. That fact can feel unsettling, because it denies us a clean separation between destruction and creation. On Earth, they are often entangled. Consider what volcanism on this scale really means for a living planet. Flood basalts are not just vast landscapes of cooling lava, they are engines of atmospheric disturbance. Carbon dioxide drives warming, sulfur compounds can alter sunlight and weather in shorter intervals. If magma intrudes into carbon-rich sediments, additional greenhouse gases may be released. Acid rain can stress terrestrial systems. Increased rainfall can intensify weathering and nutrient runoff. In the oceans, the influx of carbon and nutrients can destabilize oxygen balance and marine chemistry. Everything begins interacting with everything else. Climate, geology, and biology become inseparable once again. And that inseparability is the key to the entire story we have been tracing. From the earliest Earth onward, life has never existed on a passive stage. The stage itself moves. It erupts, freezes, drifts, collides, warms, acidifies, and changes the chemistry of the air and sea. Sometimes life modifies those changes, as cyanobacteria did when they oxygenated the atmosphere. Sometimes life merely endures them, as microbes did beneath global ice. Sometimes life expands magnificently in the openings created by a warmer world or a rearranged coastline. And sometimes it is cut down because the pace or scale of change overwhelms even a successful biosphere. What emerges from all of this is not a comforting story of steady progress. It is a story of repeated planetary reinvention. The molten Hadean world became a watery microbial world. The orange haze Earth became an oxygenating planet. The frozen snowball Earth thawed into oceans ready for complexity. The Devonian world built forests and vertebrate experiments on land. Pangaea created climates of brutal contrast. The end Permian nearly emptied the biosphere. The Jurassic and Cretaceous raised giant animals into dominance. Chicxulub ended that reign in geological moments. Volcanic crises elsewhere helped older competitors decline and newer dynasties rise. Again and again, the Earth changed so profoundly that each age might have seemed impossible from the vantage of the last. And through all of it, the deepest constant is not stability, but continuity through instability. Life persists, not because Earth is gentle, but because over immense timescales, the biosphere learns, diversifies, and spreads its risks across forms and environments. No single lineage is guaranteed. Entire dynasties vanish. But the living world as a whole keeps finding ways to survive, adapt, and reassemble. Microbes wait out disasters in hidden refuges. Small animals inherit worlds built by the extinction of giants. Plants redraw continents with roots and carbon cycles. Oceans collapse and refill with new forms of abundance. Every ending becomes selective, and every selective ending becomes the starting condition for something the previous world could not have predicted. That may be the most profound answer to the question we began with. What would an alien observer think if it visited Earth again and again across deep time? It would not see one stable planet gradually improving itself. It would see a succession of worlds, each real, each temporary, each built out of the ruins and opportunities of the one before. It would see that habitability is not a permanent trait, but a moving target maintained through interacting systems. It would see that the atmosphere you breathe, the oceans that regulate climate, the soils beneath forests, and even the structure of food webs are all historical achievements, fragile in the short term and astonishing in the long term. And perhaps, on the final visit, that observer would find us. Not as the end point of Earth's story, and certainly not as its guaranteed future, but as one more recent lineage trying to understand the planet that made it. We arrived after oxygen revolutions, after frozen planets, after giant fungi, after sail-backed predators, after the Great Dying, after the age of dinosaurs, after asteroid winter, after mammalian expansion. Every layer of our world is inherited from deep time. Every breath depends on changes set in motion billions of years before humans existed. Even our sense that Earth is familiar is, in a way, an illusion produced by living inside only one brief chapter
of a very long narrative.
Because the real Earth is stranger than the version we usually carry in our minds. It is a planet that learns stability from violence, complexity from crisis, and resilience from repeated collapse. It is a world where oceans arrived on a molten surface, where microbes remade the sky, where ice gripped the equator, where forests changed the chemistry of the air, where supercontinents bred extremes, where volcanoes nearly erased complex life, where giant reptiles dominated for ages, and where one asteroid shifted the future toward creatures once hidden in the underbrush. It is not a static home. It is an ongoing experiment in what a living planet can survive and become. That realization should not make Earth feel less precious. It should make it feel more extraordinary. Because against all expectation, across all those alien versions of itself, this world kept going. Not smoothly, not safely, not predictably, but continuously. And from that continuity emerged coral reefs and redwoods, whales and hawks, deserts and rainforests, human beings and human questions. We are the descendants of a planet that never stopped changing, trying to understand the ancient engine of change that carried us here. And if there is one final lesson in that long record, it may be this. Earth does not owe any species permanence. It offers possibility, but only within the shifting terms of geology, climate, and time. To study its past is to understand how fragile dominance can be, how powerful resilience can become, and how deeply our own existence depends on worlds that vanished long before we arrived. The planet beneath our feet feels stable only because this particular moment allows it to. But deep time tells another story, that Earth has always been many worlds, that catastrophe and creation have always walked together here, and that the true nature of our home is not stillness, but transformation without end.